This lesson is all about how to predict what will happen when parents combine genes in offspring. So, this whole lesson is going to use Punnett squares and pedigrees to predict those. Punnett squares and pedigrees are just different kinds of charts that we use to figure out the probability that will happen when parents combine genes. A lot of these notes, so the notes themselves are very short, but you will need your actual textbook because there's going to be a lot of different charts and diagrams that we fill in along the way. Okay. So the point of a Punnett square, and a Punnett square is what you see down here. This is a screenshot from your book. The point of a Punnett square is to show the pattern of heredity, to show the probability or the possibility of different offspring genotypes, which will then show us different offspring phenotype possibilities. So the way a Punnett square is set up is that the parents' alleles are on the top and the left side of the Punnett square. It doesn't really matter which parent goes where. So it doesn't really matter, but one parent genes go on top, one parent genes go on the left side, and then you just simply fill in the square. If you have a capital F up here, then you're going to put a capital F in all the boxes underneath it. If you have a capital F up here, you're going to put a capital F in all the boxes underneath it. If you have a lowercase f over here, you're going to put a lowercase f in all the boxes to its right. Then if you have a lowercase f down in the bottom, you're going to put a lowercase f in all the boxes to its right. So this little Punnett square here is showing what would happen if I were to cross a purple flower, which is dominant, with a white flower. If that purple flower is homozygous dominant, that means it has two dominant alleles. And then the white flower is homozygous recessive. That means it has two lowercase recessive alleles. If I cross those two flowers, then what are my possibilities of different phenotypes and genotypes? Well, if I cross them, I do my Punnett square and I figure out every single one of my offspring, there is a 100% chance that all of my offspring are going to be heterozygous. Remember, we learned that term last unit or last lesson. Heterozygous means my offspring have one of each, a capital and a lowercase. But if you only have one capital letter, so one dominant trait, then that's what's going to show in your phenotype. So my offspring are all going to be purple. If I cross this purple flower with this white flower, I have a 100% chance of all of my offspring being purple offspring. Okay, so flip to page 341 in your textbook. We are going to do a Punnett square here where we cross two different P types. Let's read the directions and we'll figure it out. It says, fill in the genotypes and phenotypes of the parents and offspring in this Punnett square. Sketch the resulting offspring possibilities in the white boxes below. Assume complete dominance. So that means that a round allele that is dominant over the wrinkled allele. Okay, so round allele is represented with a capital R, wrinkled allele is represented with a lowercase r. So I am crossing a parent up top, and it tells me that my parent up top has a capital R and a lowercase r. That is that parent's genotype. The genes it carries are capital lowercase. It's heterozygous, meaning it has one of each. The phenotype, so what we physically see in this parent is that it is round. Okay, that's not a wrinkled P, that's round. Over here on the left side, this is my other plant I'm going to cross with. I've got a capital lowercase. So again, its genotype is heterozygous. I've got a capital lowercase. And its phenotype, again, you can see is round. So if I cross a round P and a round P, I would expect probably to get round Ps, right? But remember, these are not homozygous Ps. They are heterozygous. So they carry that wrinkled gene. It's just hidden. It's recessive. They carry it. So there's a possibility they could pass on that genotype or that gene, that allele to their offspring. So if I fill in my Punnett square, I'm going to see this box here is going to get a capital R from parent on top and a capital R from the parent on the left. The box in the, and the phenotype of that offspring would be it's round. Okay, so that is a round P. That's one of my possibilities of my offspring is going to be 25% round P. Top right box, I'm going to take the capital R from the left-hand side and the lowercase r from the top. So my offspring here is going to have a capital lowercase. It's heterozygous. It is still going to be round, right? Because we know even if it has one dominant trait, that's what's going to show in the phenotype. So again, I've got a round P. So now I have a 50% chance instead of just 25, a 50% chance of having a round P offspring. Let's go to the bottom left. I'm getting a capital letter from my top parent and a lowercase letter from my left parent, and that's going to give me another heterozygous offspring. If you're heterozygous, that means you're carrying that one dominant allele. So that dominant allele is going to show up. It's going to be a round P. Okay, you should be filling this in your book on page 341 and drawing these. So now I'm at 75% chance of having a round P offspring. Okay. But this last box here, if I carry my lowercase r down from the top and I carry my lowercase r over from the left, I've now got two lowercase alleles. So now I'm homozygous recessive for that recessive trait, which is wrinkled. So this offspring is going to be a wrinkled P. So I have 25% chance of my offspring being round. 75% chance of my offspring being round and a 25% chance of my offspring ending up wrinkled if I cross two heterozygous parents in this Punnett square. Punnett squares, like I said, they're just used to make predictions. They are not to give exact for sure outcomes. They're just showing probability. So every time you combine these parents' alleles, so if I'm going back to that round and wrinkled example from the last slide, every time those parents combine their alleles, so every time they cross-pollinate, they have a 25% chance of having a wrinkled offspring. It's not, it had 1, 2, 3 offspring. The last one is definitely going to be wrinkled. It's every single time it has a new probability to produce round, 75% probability of producing round offspring, 25% chance of producing wrinkled offspring. This probability can also be expressed as a ratio. Sometimes you'll see that ratio expressed with a colon in the middle. So this would say like 3 out of 4 chance of a round P offspring, 1 out of 4, 1 colon 4, 1 to 4 chance of a wrinkled offspring. This little picture here is a screenshot from your book. You would say 1 out of 4 squares is red, or 3 out of 4 squares are blue, or there's a 75% chance of blue squares or a 25% chance of red squares. Okay. This is an example problem about crossing guinea pigs, specifically talking about their fur color. Okay, so we'll go through this example and then we'll walk through our own example on the next slide here. So this is on page 342 in your book. In guinea pigs, the dominant capital B allele is responsible for black fur, while the recessive lowercase b allele is responsible for brown fur. Use the Punnett square to find the probability of this cross resulting in an offspring with brown fur. So what do we know? We know by looking at my Punnett square, my parents have a capital B, lowercase b, and then lowercase b. So I have a heterozygous parent and a homozygous recessive parent. And what are we trying to find out? We're trying to find out what are my probabilities of different color offsprings in guinea pig fur. So I'm going to count the total number of offsprings. First I'm going to fill in my Punnett square. I'm going to carry this capital B down, carry this lowercase b down, carry this lowercase b over, and carry this lowercase b over. And I end up with 2 heterozygous black fur guinea pigs and 2 homozygous recessive brown fur guinea pigs. Total number of offspring is 4. Count the number of allele combinations that would result in brown fur, 2. You could write it as a ratio as 2 to 4. You could write it as a probability of 50 to 100 or 50% as well. Okay, so let's do our own example. It says this Punnett square shows a cross between 2 heterozygous, so capital B, lowercase b, guinea pigs. What is the probability of the cross resulting in an offspring with black fur? So what do we know? Well, we know both parents have capital B, lowercase b, and if I cross them, my possible offspring are a capital, I've got some capital lowercases, and lowercase. So I have every possible genetic outcome as a possibility. So we're trying to find the probability of a black fur offspring. There are 4 boxes here showing my possible offspring outcomes, and 3 out of 4 of them have black fur. So that's telling me that I have a 3 to 4 chance. There we go. A 3 to 4 chance of an offspring having black fur. I also could write it as 75 to 100 or 75% chance, right? Because 3 out of 4 of those boxes is black fur guinea pig. So that would be a 75% chance. Those are all just different ways that you could write that ratio. So then using that same cross, it says in the cross above, what's the ratio of each of the possible genotypes? Show your results by filling in the pie chart at the right. Fill in the key with a color or shading to show which pieces of the chart represent different genotypes. If all you have is a pencil, you can just do like different like shading patterns, like, do a full shade, a blank, and then like a shade maybe with like hash marks or dots in it. But for my example, I'm going to use gray for capital, red for capital lowercase, and white for lowercase. And I'm shading mine in. I had a 50% chance of heterozygous, so a capital lowercase. So half of my circle is going to end up red. A quarter of my circle is going to end up homozygous dominant, and a quarter of my circle is going to be left white homozygous recessive. The next kind of chart that we're going to talk about is not a Punnett square. It's a pedigree. Pedigrees might look kind of familiar. They look kind of like a family tree, and they basically are. A pedigree is a family tree that can track not necessarily people and birthdays like you might see on a family tree, but you'll see a specific trait that can get tracked through a family. This can be really helpful when you're trying to track an inherited disease or an inherited disorder that a family might have, okay? Like Huntington's disease or something like that. So pedigrees can trace any inherited trait through a family. Sometimes you'll see pedigrees that trace really innocent things like eye color or something like that. But oftentimes you'll see pedigrees that want to trace a disease or a disorder. Some of those traits that you might track are called sex-linked traits. That just means that particular trait, it may not have to do with being male or female, but it would sit on the X or the Y chromosome. Like baldness is one of those traits. It has nothing to do with whether you're male or female if you lose hair, but it sits on the sex chromosomes, the X or Y chromosomes that determine whether you're a male or a female. And color blindness, same thing. It doesn't, being able to see certain colors in a certain way has nothing to do with being male or female, but it sits on the sex chromosome. That's where that gene exists. There's different symbols in a pedigree, so let's learn how to read them first. And those symbols can indicate whether a person is male or female, genetically speaking, as well as if they are affected by that trait, they are unaffected by that trait, or they carry the trait. Okay. This chart here on this slide shows all of those things. Squares are males, circles are females. This is just universal. Every pedigree will look like this. Every pedigree that has squares and circles, the square means male, circle means female. If you see a vertical line connecting two people, that means that they are married. And if you have a line going down from those two people, that means they had offspring, biological offspring. Okay. If that circle or square is shaded in, that means they carry the trait. So if you're tracking baldness, for instance, then that person has baldness or is bald. Okay. If you see that it is not filled in, then that person is not affected by whatever you're tracking. If we have a situation, if the disease is a recessive disease or disorder, or trait that we're tracking, if it's recessive, you might see some shapes that are halfway filled in. They might be diagonal, they might be up and down or side to side halfway, but if they're halfway filled in, then that means that person is a carrier of that trait. They don't necessarily display it in their phenotype, but they carry it and could pass it to their offspring. So let's take a look at this pedigree. This is an example from your book on page 344. So again, we have our key here on the right that I just went over with you on the last slide. But this pedigree, like I said, looks a lot like a family tree because it is. This family tree shows four generations of people. We had person one and person two. Person one is male, person two is female, and they're both carriers of this disease. Our book tells us that the disease we're tracking here is cystic fibrosis. So in generation number one, great-grandma and grandpa are both carriers of cystic fibrosis. Great-grandma and grandpa had 5 kids, okay? Kid number one did not have cystic fibrosis. I know that because that girl, I know she's a girl because she's a circle, that girl did not have cystic fibrosis because she's not filled in, okay? Boy number 2, so child number 2 is a male. He did not have cystic fibrosis either, but he carries the gene for it. I know that because he's halfway filled in. So he must have gotten a dominant gene from one parent and a recessive gene from the other parent. Okay. Daughter number 1 got dominant from both parents because cystic fibrosis is a recessive trait. Child number 3 is a son. He's a boy, or he's genetically male. And this person did not have cystic fibrosis. He ended up getting the dominant gene from dad, dominant gene from mom. Child number 4 is a girl. She did get the recessive allele from both mom and dad, so she does have cystic fibrosis. Person number 5, so kid number 5, the youngest one, is a son. He is a carrier of cystic fibrosis. So he got a dominant allele from one parent, a recessive allele from the other. So that's generation number 2. Kid number 5 marries a girl who does not have cystic fibrosis. She doesn't even carry it. They together have 3 kids, a kid, an oldest daughter and a middle son who do not carry the gene, do not have the gene. And then their third daughter carries that gene for cystic fibrosis. So dad passed on that recessive allele to that third daughter. That third daughter who carries it, she doesn't have cystic fibrosis. It's not showing up in her phenotype, but she carries it. She marries a guy who also is a carrier of cystic fibrosis. They have 3 kids. Now we're in the 4th generation. They have 3 kids, and 2 of their kids have cystic fibrosis. 1 is a carrier. So child number 1 is a daughter. That daughter got a recessive from mom and dad. Child number 2 got recessive from mom and dad. And child number 3 got a recessive and a dominant allele from mom or dad. We're not sure which parent gave this daughter which allele. Question number 11 asks us, does anyone in the 3rd generation have cystic fibrosis? The answer to that is no. No, absolutely not. They might carry it. So child number 3 and then that person's husband, they carry cystic fibrosis as a recessive allele, but they do not have cystic fibrosis. Okay. And then question number 12, what is the probability that the child of 2 carriers, like child 3 and 4, what's the probability that the child of 2 carriers will have cystic fibrosis? In order to do that, we need to do a little Punnett square, okay? So we're going to see 2 carriers. We're going to cross 2 carriers. That means 2 people who are heterozygous. They have a dominant allele and a recessive allele, one of each. So let's do that. Let's use the letter F here to represent cystic fibrosis. And F is a good letter to use because it's very clear the difference between a dominant and a recessive. When you're choosing letters to use for Punnett squares, don't choose letters like C or S or O, because those are very difficult to tell what's a capital and what's a lowercase. So I'm going to cross a parent who is heterozygous and a parent who's heterozygous, and I'm going to see what's my probability that these parents are going to have a kid with cystic fibrosis. So my first offspring possibility is capital from top, capital from the left, not affected. They don't even carry it. They don't have it. My second child here, possibility, gets a capital F from the left parent, a lowercase f from the top parent. They don't have cystic fibrosis, but they carry it. My third child here, or my third possibility, would get a capital F from top, a lowercase f from the side. They don't have cystic fibrosis, but again, they carry it. And then my last possibility is a lowercase f, lowercase f. That offspring would be affected, would have cystic fibrosis. So what's the probability? My probability is that 1 out of 4, I have a 1 out of 4 chance, or a 1 to 4 ratio, or a 25% chance that 2 carriers would have a child with cystic fibrosis. Is that what ended up happening here in generation 4? No, we ended up seeing 2 out of 3 kids with cystic fibrosis. This is because this Punnett square doesn't necessarily tell you a guaranteed outcome. It tells you the probability. Every time those parents combine their genes, you get a new 25% chance of having a kid with cystic fibrosis, and then a new 25% chance of a kid with cystic fibrosis every single time you combine genes. Okay, so I hope that those notes were helpful, walking through all those examples. Make sure you fill in your books in these sections, because that'll be very helpful for you when it comes time to take your test, which is coming up soon, since this is the last section. Make sure that you pay attention to all the practice problems throughout class, and let me know if you have any questions.